Hey biology students, this is the third video in our lecture 16 series on the theory of evolution, and the title of this video is Evidence of Evolution. So in this video, we are going to address this question: how do we know evolution happens? So we've been talking about the theory of evolution, and of course, using that term theory in science means something very different than the word theory in modern language. So you might hear somebody say, oh, I have a theory about why you're not doing well on your biology exams. It's because you're not listening to Professor Gideon's lectures she's been so painstakingly creating for you for distance learning. Hint, hint. And there, when you use it in that connotation, you're using this word theory more like an idea or a guess. And that is not the connotation that we use in science. When we use the word theory in science, it is the closest thing we have to the term fact. Okay? And so the theory of evolution is in the same category as other very famous scientific theories like the theory of gravity or atomic theory or Einstein's theory of relativity. But something stands out with theory of evolution, which is actually, at least in my opinion, is that very few people in the world can really understand, for example, Einstein's theory of relativity. You know, very few people understand the physics involved in that. But when it comes to Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, it's really quite simple, especially the mechanism of natural selection. It's really a very elegant theory, and it explains the natural world so that everything we know in terms of how the natural world works is explained in the theory of evolution. So be careful about that, because definitely some people will say, well, you know, evolution is just a theory, in a way trying to discredit it by saying that. But really, by saying that evolution is just a theory, it's really demonstrating that you don't understand what we mean in science by a theory. So remember, I also mentioned in the previous videos that I don't really consider evolution to be a belief system. I think that is more what we talk about in terms of religion. Religion is a belief system. Evolution isn't a belief system. It's a body of evidence. So I would say that I accept the theory of evolution based on the evidence. I wouldn't say I believe in evolution, okay, in the same way you might use that word in more of a religious connotation. So the reason why I accept evolution, and almost all actually legitimate scientists do accept the theory of evolution, is that everything we know points to this explanation for the natural world. So today in this lecture, we're going to look at three general categories of evidence that supports the theory of evolution. And so we put these into three categories, the first being fossil evidence, the second being anatomical evidence, and with that we discuss vestigial structures, homologous structures, and comparative embryology. And then the third line of evidence is molecular evidence. So recall Charles Darwin, and there's a very famous notation that he makes in his laboratory notebook, and it's very famous today. It's the sketch that he makes in his laboratory notebook, and he says, I think, and then he sketches this tree, this connection. And what he's doing here is he's hypothesizing based on the theory of evolution and his understanding of natural selection. He hypothesizes that all life on this planet has an origin, a single origin. And from that origin, this life, all life has branched from that origin into these different branches of life and diverging with different traits, different strategies, and different adaptations for dealing with the world and the environment. Now, very important here, though, that at this time point in the early 1850s, he writes, I think, because there really wasn't a lot of evidence that Charles Darwin had at his fingertips to support his theory of evolution. And this should also give you confidence in the theory of evolution because, if modern day evidence could refute the theory of evolution, that would make you the most famous scientist on Earth. And when it comes to scientific research, you see, we scientists, we don't just like to sit around and just pat each other on the back and say, oh yeah, you got this right, you got this right. No, we try to refute each other. We try to do research that contradicts the norm because that's how you become famous. That's how you make really significant discoveries in science, not by just patting each other on the back. And so at this point, when he writes, I think, there really wasn't a lot of evidence. And if evolution was not a body of factual information, then modern day biology would really refute what we know, okay, what he proposed here. But rather, the opposite is true. Rather, everything we know in biology, it can be explained based on the theory of evolution. It's really not something you can remove from a biology curriculum because it is such a central body of understanding that all scientific research and understanding points to. So one of the major conclusions that Darwin makes, and he actually publishes another book after his book on the origin of species, and he calls it The Descent of Man. And he makes this conclusion that all living things are related and descend from common ancestors. And so that is a term that we use a lot in evolutionary biology. So what is a common ancestor? Well, to think about that, you might want to think about your own family tree. So your common ancestors, so your cousins, for example, you and your cousins, your first cousins, you would share a common ancestor. Your most recent common ancestor would be your grandparents. So you share a set of grandparents with your cousins. So your grandparents would be your common ancestor that you share with your cousins. And of course, you have a lot of shared physical characteristics with your cousins because of that shared common ancestry. Well, what we're saying here in evolutionary terms is that if you go back thousands of years, millions of years, billions of years, you're going to find all of these branches in this tree of life on this planet, and the evidence points to a single common origin. A single common origin, a single-celled ancestor, very similar to a bacteria that lived about 3.8 billion years ago. So this life from that original origin going back 3.8 billion years ago has evolved and branched into all of the life forms that we know of now on this planet. And we call that process of descending from common ancestors. That process would be called common descent. So now I want to replace Charles Darwin's sketch here, his I think, where there wasn't a lot of evidence to support it, to what we know in modern biology. In modern biology, we can replace this initial sort of tree of life that Charles Darwin sketched in the 1800s, and we can replace it with this modern day tree of life. So in this modern day tree of life, what we're seeing again is the history of life on this planet. That the history of life on this planet had a common origin, a single common origin. And this single common origin was a prokaryote. So it was a single-celled organism. And this prokaryote lived approximately 3.8 billion years ago. From that single origin, all life on this planet has continued to branch from single-celled organisms like bacteria and archaea and protists to the animals, to invertebrate animals, to fungi, to vertebrates, to mammals, to amphibians, to reptiles, and then here's humans way up here on the branch at the top. And so really this tree of life, this is in terms of time. If we look at time from more ancient origins to more recent origins. This is hard to comprehend in our human brains, geological time, isn't it? Because it's hard to even remember sometimes what we were doing just last week or last month or 2 months ago or 6 months ago. And now thinking about what occurred in the history of this planet billions of years ago, millions of years ago, it is really, really hard to fathom geological time. So that's why evidence helps us understand this process. So let's start with the evidence. So the first line of evidence that supports this massive change in form of life on this planet from single-celled origins to more complex life is the fossil record, okay, fossil evidence. How do we define a fossil? We define it as the preserved direct or indirect evidence of life from the past. So direct evidence refers to, for example, finding bones. So finding bones that have been preserved, like you can see here on the left side of the screen, we're looking at a preserved skeleton of an ancient ancestor within our hominid lineage. So not human, okay, but not ape either. So a common ancestor that we share with modern primates, okay, like other chimpanzees. And so these fossilized bones, we could piece that together. We can learn things about the anatomy of these individuals. So we could learn, for example, in the pelvis, we can learn that the way that these individuals articulated that pelvis was in an upright walking motion. And this is an artist's representation. This is a figure that's been created by an artist based off of the bone structure found in many fossilized skeletons of these hominid ancestors within the genus Australopithecines. So these were our ape-like ancestors that look very much like modern day apes, don't they? Brain size would be ape-like brain size, but the pelvic structure tells us that these individuals walked on two legs. We call that, by the way, we call that bipedalism, walking on two legs, and that's a unique trait to individuals in what we call the hominid lineage. which we are a part of, okay? Being able to walk on 2 feet instead of walking on 4 limbs, which we see other primates walking on 4 limbs, walking on 2 legs, that is a hominid trait. And we could see that in the fossil record for these individuals. And then, of course, there's indirect evidence. We could see not actual physical bones, but we might find things like what you see here, footprints, cave paintings, tools. So indirect evidence of life from the past. So this is a type of fossil where it's an impression fossil. So it's a casting of somebody's footprints. If you look closely there, you'll notice there's actually 2 sets of footprints. There's a larger set of footprints and a smaller set of footprints, and they're very close together. And this looks as though we have an adult and a child walking side by side, holding hands probably, because they're so close together. They're probably a parent and a child. And what we can do, and I'm going to explain how this works a little bit in the next slide, is that we can get an approximate age. How old are these footprints? How old are these skeletons that we find? And when it comes to, in particular, what we're looking at on this slide, it's approximately 2 to 3 million years old. So approximately 2 to 3 million years ago. We see these individuals would be walking around in Africa, not traditional apes, not modern day apes, and not modern day humans either. This was not a human, but this was not an ape. This was something in between. Okay. I think it's a really important thing to note about the fossil record, to know that it actually, we refer to it as incomplete. And what we mean by that is that the fossilization process, the process that would preserve bones or tools or these footprints or an impression of maybe a soft-bodied animal, that's a really rare thing. It's almost a random thing. So the animal or the plant would have had to have died in the perfectly opportune location where it could be preserved and it wouldn't be completely decayed, that there would be sedimentary rock and that would be able to encase the bones of this organism. So we understand that we don't have a full fossil record of every living thing and every extinct thing on this planet. But we do have quite a lot of evidence that tells us a story of the past. And just a little bit more on how we approximate the age of living things. Well, this can be done using something called radiometric dating. So certain isotopes can actually decay at a constant rate that we call their half-life. And this can be used to determine the age of a fossil that is found. Very common is to use carbon-14. Carbon-14 is an isotope of carbon. And carbon-14 has a half-life. What they're trying to show us here is this T half. This is half-life. The amount of time takes for the isotope to decay. It's going to be breaking apart, okay, by half. And it's a constant value for each isotope, which is very useful in determining the age of a specimen. For example, carbon-14 has a half-life, a T half there, half-life of approximately 5,700 years. So every 5,700 years, the amount of carbon in an organism would be breaking down by half. And so you can determine how many half-lives the carbon has undergone, and then that can lead you to determine the age of that fossil. So here it's telling us, for example, if there's 3 half-lives, we're close to 20,000-year-old specimen. Now, carbon-14, because it has such a relatively short half-life, wouldn't be useful, notice, to determine the age of anything greater than about 35,000 years old. It wouldn't be very useful. So you can use other types of isotopes. For example, potassium-40. Potassium-40 has a half-life of around 1.1 billion years. So now we could really date rocks that go back billions of years ago. What do we learn from the fossil record? Some species used to be very common, but have now disappeared. So some examples, maybe the dinosaurs, maybe these guys, trilobites. Trilobites, a type of arthropod, an invertebrate animal that lived millions of years ago, and up until about 250 million years ago, you would find these everywhere. And they were, some were smaller and some were larger, but trilobites were extremely, extremely common. And then about 250 million years ago, we never see them again. They go extinct. There's a general trend in the fossil record. So the oldest fossils are single-celled, okay, are very simple cells. And as we move up in the fossil record, we see more complex organisms, okay, in the younger fossils. So there's this ordering of complexity. There's also interesting finds called transitional fossils. These are really like the unicorns of the fossil record because this is showing us something very rare where you can see a transition in an organism where it's showing features of 2 different ways of life, and it's transitioning from one way of life to another. Let me give you some examples. This fossil find that dates to 375 million years ago, that's what MYA stands for, million years ago. This fossil is called Tiktaalik. And the cool thing about Tiktaalik is this looks very much like a fish in many respects. However, it has these limbs, okay? So it definitely has some fossilized limbs. And this is the artist's representation of what Tiktaalik might have looked like if you could go back 375 million years ago. But it's a very important transition in the history of life. It's the transition from fish-like ancestors to what we call tetrapods, where they have 4 limbs, and of course these would be amphibians. Another famous transitional fossil is the Archaeopteryx fossil, dated at 150 million years ago. And what Archaeopteryx fossil, now this was a casting fossil preserved in stone, but this is another transition. And the transition for Archaeopteryx is it's showing us a reptile to bird transition. So it has some very characteristic reptilian traits, including teeth and reptilian claws, but you can even see it in the casting, the feathers. So this was a feathered reptile showing a transition to birds. One of my favorite evolutionary stories is the evolution of the whale, and what it tells us in a relatively short amount of time, about 50 million years, we see a very dramatic change in form. So whales, if we look in their fossil history, Their ancestors were land mammals that had 4 limbs. They lived on land. And of course, even modern day whales are mammals. They're not fish, okay? They're mammals like us. And to be a mammal means, of course, you have hair, you're warm-blooded, you have live birth, nurse your young, those sorts of things. And this is the case for whales. And when we look in their fossil history, we see that their ancestors, so the common ancestor that the whales have, common ancestor was a land mammal. Now, the amazing thing to me is that there's evidence in the anatomy of modern whales that their ancestors had 4 limbs. Of course, we can see in their front fins that these fins are not fish fins. So fish fins don't have bones in them, okay? So having bones in your fins, with appendages that look very much like land mammals, or what we call the pentadactyl limbs. But the other amazing thing is what we see in the back limbs. What we see in the back of the whale is we see hip bones. We actually see a pelvic bones here. Now we are going into the second line of evidence of evolution. So remember, the first line of evidence is the fossil record. The second line of evidence is anatomical evidence, evidence in the anatomy of organisms. And so if we look at the whale skeleton, modern day whale skeleton, we see these very reduced in size hip bones. But the thing about having hip bones is there's no reason why you would have hip bones unless you're going to articulate limbs, okay, legs. Obviously, whales no longer have limbs. So, and even you can tell these bones are not even attached to their vertebrae anymore. But this gives us basically, it tells the story of their evolutionary past. And we call these structures that we see in the whales, we call them vestigial. So that's a really important word to understand what that means. So this refers to structures present in the living organisms today. We sort of think of them as leftovers of evolution. And importantly, though, the organ or structure, in order to be vestigial, we would say that it served a purpose in the ancestor, but it's either not serving the same purpose anymore or no purpose at all in the modern organism. So there's really no reason for whales to have a pelvis or to have hip bones, because the purpose of the hip bones is obviously to articulate limbs, and they don't have that. This is also similar in snakes. So snakes also have vestigial limbs. They call them spurs, but really, really tiny legs, and that's because snakes share common ancestors with reptiles that had limbs. Here's another one of my favorite examples of vestigial structures. These are blind cave fish. So they live deep down in dark caves where there's no advantage of having being able to see because it's dark. So they don't have eyes, but they do have the eye sockets. So here we're comparing them to their close cousin. The surface-dwelling fish obviously do have eyes, but the cave-dwelling fish, instead of eyes, they have vestigial eye sockets, okay? And so there's no reason to have eye sockets unless, your ancestors had eyes, right? It makes sense, though, that they lost this trait in their evolutionary history, that natural selection would have selected for fish without producing the eye structure, even though it has the socket for the eye. They don't have the eye structure. That makes sense if you don't need eyes, because eyes can actually be a source of infection. It can be an entry point for bacteria and viruses to get into your body. And so having that would not be useful unless you really needed eyes for seeing. More anatomical evidence. This is in the branch of anatomical evidence we call homologous structures. And we've actually seen this word before when we talk about chromosomes. So homologous, remember what this word means. It means speaking the same language. That's literally what the term homologous translates to. So there's something similar here going on. We say that these would be anatomical structures with the same form, but can have different functions. So a good example of homology is the pentadactyl limb in vertebrates, where we look at the bat and the human and the horse and the porpoise or the whales, and we see that they have the same arrangement of bones in their forelimbs, but obviously different purposes. So the bat wing is for flying compared to the horse, and the human. Very different functions, but when we look at the anatomy, the organization of those bones, it is the same in the organization of those bones, suggesting common ancestry, suggesting that we are related. Just like, once again, common ancestry within your very close biological family. If you think about your cousins and you look around at your cousins at Thanksgiving dinner and you say, oh yeah, we've all have that characteristic nose or that shape to our eyes or something along those lines. And it's because we got that from our grandmother, the maternal or the paternal side of the family, that you have your most recent common ancestor that you share. And that's, of course, what homology tells us. Homology tells us, we're related. That's what it's suggesting, is that we share common ancestry with bats, with horses, with other vertebrates. There's lots of homologies, not just in bone structures. This is taken from a scientific research paper from 2018. And in this paper, they're looking at homologies in protein structure. And they're looking at homologies between chicken feathers, chicken scales, okay, the scales they have on their feet, and alligator scales, and then mammal hair. So notice that we've got hair, we've got chicken feathers, chicken scales, alligator scales. And what they find is homology. They find the same protein, beta-catenin, okay, but also beta-carotene as well, is another protein that we share homologies. It's the same protein that's found in feathers and scales and hair. We're all related. We descend from a common ancestor that had that trait, and then it diverged into different uses of that same protein. This is also in the line of anatomical evidence. It's called comparative embryology. This is one of my favorites. Here we're looking at 5 different embryos. They are all vertebrates, so animals with a backbone. One of the 5 in this set is human. And I always have my classes vote on that when I show you this picture, and I say, let's vote on the human embryo. Which one is it? Is it embryo A? Is it embryo B? Is it embryo C? Embryo D or embryo E? Who do you think it is? So also embedded in there, I think, are chicken, and there's bat, and I forget the other ones. We'll see in a minute, okay? So let's take a look. So this is in the early developmental stage, just weeks into the development of these in the fetal development. And if you're having a hard time picking out human, which one is human in this lineup, don't feel bad that you can't figure it out. It's really hard. In the early stages of our fetal development, we don't look human. This was definitely the case. I remember when I was pregnant with my children, and you go in for your first ultrasound and they give you this picture, and you just see this little sort of bean, little lima bean sort of looking structure with a beating heart. And then later, as you keep going for your prenatal checkups, they give you more of these ultrasounds, and it's like, okay, now we're not a lima bean anymore. Now we look like a little dinosaur, right? So our babies look reptilian almost on ultrasound. Eventually, though, as you progress in your fetal development stages, it becomes clear who is the human. Can you tell yet? Okay, let's progress all the way through the fetal development stage. There you go. Here we are. The human was the 5th embryo. So we have chicken, possum, cat, and bat, and then human. And we can see just how hard that is to distinguish them, right? And that's because we share the same set of developmental instructions with other vertebrates. There's the same set of genes that codes for, look at this, actually a tail and gills. Of course, those structures go away. So eventually, when we have our babies born, they don't have tails and they don't have gills, but we do have remnants of that. Actually, the tailbone is actually vestigial. So having a tailbone is all that's left, basically, of our tail. The fact that we have a gene that codes for a tail, we have a collection of genes that codes for gills. This is very compelling evidence, at least in my opinion, that we share common ancestry with other animals. Okay, to introduce the final line of evidence supporting theory of evolution, let's take a look at this video clip together.
In the last few decades, we've seen a completely new kind of evidence emerge that demonstrates unequivocally the close relationship between humans and chimps. And that evidence has come from DNA. This is DNA. We've got DNA, chimps have got DNA, bacteria have got DNA, petunias have got DNA, crabs have got DNA. Every living animal, plant, fish, frog has got DNA. And if we compare the DNAs of any two species, we can establish how closely related they are one to another.
The sequence of the 4 chemical building blocks of DNA determines the traits of all living things. These are represented by A's, T's, C's, and G's. Each generation passes on this chemical text to its offspring. Occasional mistakes in copying, mutations, can result in new traits. Paige takes part of a gene in humans and aligns it with the corresponding sequence of the same gene found in chimps to compare the letters.
And what we see is that these two sequences, the human and chimp sequences, are spectacularly similar. They are, in fact, 98% identical. They're just a couple of spelling changes. Why are there only a couple of spelling changes? Because we and chimps had a common ancestor only a few million years ago. If more time had passed since we had our last common ancestor, more spelling changes would have accumulated.
To make that point, Paige shows the same gene sequence of a mammal that is very different from humans, the rat.
You see that there are far more differences, let's say, between the human and the rat than between the human and the chimp. That's because our common ancestor with the rat lived about 80 or 100 million years ago, and there's been much more time for spelling differences to accumulate. We've learned that in primates, DNA sequences are changing at a rate of about 1% every 3 million years. In other words, about 5 million years ago, the precursor of humans and chimps lived. And we can see that. We can, in a sense, read that right out of the DNA sequences. In the 19th century, in Darwin's time, it was audacious to claim that humans and chimps were closely related. There wasn't that much scientific evidence. But in the 20th century, we've seen the fossil record emerge.
In the 21st century, the combination of fossil record, physical features, and molecular evidence leaves no doubt that humans and apes shared a common ancestor several million years ago. And humans and apes, like those early primates, have continued to evolve ever since.
Okay, so that brings us to our third line of evidence supporting the theory of evolution. And this line of evidence is called molecular evidence. And what we mean by molecular, we mean DNA and proteins. So as you saw in the video clip, the modern day biology technology that we have, we can sequence the DNA of just about any cell, actually any cell. We have that technology. And so this literally gives you a printout of the sequence of humans, for example, chimps, mouse, rat, and we can line them up, as you see in this diagram, side by side, and you can see where those spelling changes are. And really, the DNA tells us a story of our evolutionary past. Not only can we read out of the DNA that we have a gene for tail production or gill production that we share with other tailed animals and fish and all sorts of things, but we can read out of there that we actually share similar genes with all life forms on this planet, even single-celled organisms. And that's would suggest, once again, that there's a single common ancestor for all life on this planet, and then it branched into all of the diverse life forms that we see today. There's also some other points that I'd like to make. The universal genetic code. So we have this common genetic language called DNA, and of course we can line it up and we can see where the spelling changes are, and that tells us how closely related we are to other life forms. And we can line that up side by side. For example, did you know you're actually 50% similar to bananas at the DNA level? Bananas. I don't know how different you feel than a banana, but you at the DNA level, 50% of your genes are similar, or sorry, identical to banana genes. And then that code that all cells use, when we learned about the process of decoding genes called transcription and translation in the last lecture series. So I mentioned then, I'll mention it again, it's a universal process. It's the same process in bacteria, in yeast, in animals and plants, in everybody. Also, all of the biochemical processes that utilize enzymes, remember enzymes are a type of protein. If you look at the genetic sequences and you look at the protein sequences for those enzymes, we're talking about really conserved universal processes that all cells do, like glycolysis, for example. Every single life form on this planet does glycolysis. It is the most ancient biochemical pathway, and everybody has the enzymes for it, every single cell on this planet. Cell respiration, there's lots of similarities. Photosynthesis, transcription, translation, the ribosome structures, I mean, all sorts of, again, homology, similarities that are really cannot be disputed, that there is this relationship, okay, between all of us. And although it can be really hard for people to accept that we are related to even single-celled organisms and that we are related to other, say, primates, that we are related to other chimpanzees, the evidence definitely supports this. So I wanted to leave you with one more piece of molecular evidence. This comes in the form of chromosomal evidence showing our close relationship with modern chimpanzees. So what you can tell from this family tree on the upper right of the screen, here we're looking at a family tree showing the common ancestor that we share with other primates. So this common ancestor from the fossil record, we approximate lived somewhere between 5 to 7 million years ago. And then we get a branching to many other primate groups, including the chimpanzees, and then we have the more modern hominid lineages. So one thing you'll notice is this is telling us the total number of chromosomes in the common ancestor, as well as in chimpanzees and gorillas and bonobos. Compare 48 total chromosomes, in other words, 24 chromosome pairs, compared to humans and other hominid lineages where we have 46 chromosome pairs. So what scientists realized, this was actually from 2005, some research that was published, was that the chimpanzee chromosome 2A and 2B, now remember chromosome structures have a central region we call the centromere. You may not be familiar with this term. Telomere refers to the ends of chromosomes. They're called telomeres, shown here in red. And what scientists discovered was that our chromosome, human chromosome number 2, is actually a fusion of these two chimpanzee chromosomes, chromosomes 2A and 2B, telling us somewhere along the line in the path of evolution that led to us, these chromosomes that we share with our primate ancestors actually fused together. And the evidence of that is that human chromosome number 2 has 2 centromeres instead of 1 centromere, and telomere DNA in the middle of the chromosome, as well as on the ends of the chromosome. But it's as if that 2A and 2B of the chimpanzee chromosomes were fused together or scotch taped together. So this is really powerful evidence, again, that we share common ancestry with chimpanzees. Now, please note that this is different than saying we descended from chimpanzees. So sometimes people make a false statement, oh, I didn't evolve from chimpanzees, I didn't come from monkeys, those sorts of things. That's actually a false way of thinking about that. Once again, remember your cousins. You wouldn't say, I descended from my cousins. I came from my cousins. No, you share common ancestry. You descended from your common ancestor with your cousins, which would be your grandparents. So in the same way, we would say our chimpanzees are a very distant cousin of the modern Homo sapien humans, and that we share common ancestry, but we did not descend from chimpanzees. So hopefully that clarifies that for you. And hopefully this was enlightening and helps you understand why theory of evolution is so important in biology and is so very well supported by evidence we have of the physical world.